My name is Kei Kreutler, and I'm an artist, web developer, researcher, and I've been involved with the project for about 2 years now. Just going to pull up some slides for a nice photo album of unMonastery for a little bit. So this is Matera, and I came to be involved with the unMonastery project by actually seeing the word unMonastery on the internet. So I thought, what is this? This is a really interesting model. And I submitted an application to an open call. And without really being aware of the fact that this would happen, I showed up in Matera about 4 months later. So in thinking about how to talk about this project with everyone today, there's been 40, 60, 100 people involved, possibly more, who made it possible and still create the project. But I think everyone involved has their own kind of story. So the story I tell is going to be one particular to my experience of the project. And I think the first question that we always have to answer is, what is unMonastery? People say, I like it, this sounds interesting, so what is it? So it's a social innovation model for a long-term co-living space inspired by monastic rule, sort of daily routine, harmonious living patterns, cooperative work, and hackerspace design patterns, which are tools used in makerspaces in order to kind of function more operatively. And residents in them, in unMonasteries, work together and work with the local community to give sustainable mutual aid and develop kind of alternative economic models in order to embed them in the community and also facilitate connections between disparate groups that might not have them otherwise. And to get to where we are today, there's a potential second-tier aspiration of a network of spaces throughout Europe. And we kind of sometimes cheekily hint at the possibility of an open-source monastic order. So where we get to is, this is a picture of the Council of Europe, Strasbourg 2012, the first Living on the Edge conference, where the unMonastery concept came up. And EdgeWriters is kind of this think tank platform of artists, activists, hackers, policymakers, grassroots, and they convened in the Council of Europe in 2012 to kind of talk about where we were and what projects they were working on that addressed really pressing needs, whether it's collapsonomics, state in a box, stacktivism. And everyone was working really hard on these interesting projects, but often kind of taking time outside of their day job, sometimes working in isolation and alienation from each other, and only getting these kind of rare moments to meet up if they aren't talking online. And they said, wouldn't it be great if we had an infrastructure to support this, to prevent burnout, some sort of network effect? And so then they were thinking, what institutions can we look to? What is the current context of Europe? So we have disused property, and we have high rates of unemployment, off and on, as was mentioned this morning, the overeducated, and also the rise of austerity policies. So the fact that we can't depend upon state institutions, if we ever could, to deliver certain services like welfare, pension, etc. So then we have this kind of radical paralysis blocking people, needs, resources, capacity. And even though they might be able to exist, there might be a possibility of a post-scarcity world. But right now it's really allocation of these things, and it's really the convivial spirit between them that might be blocked. So what kind of institutions can we look to if you want to build something sustainable, resilient, to connect these people? And one person mentioned monasteries. So yeah, that's with a 2,000 plus year history, that's fairly resilient. And it's people living together and working together in communities, sometimes embedded, sometimes creating value for the community, brewing beer. And then they said, well, what does monasticism look like in the 21st century? A new monasticism, an old monasticism? And what are these kind of spaces we can create? And it would be non-hierarchical, non-exclusionary, and non-patriarchal. So this is the door to the first unMonastery in Matera where I arrived. So it took place in February to July 2014, a 6-month prototype kind of supported by Matera 2019 in their bid for Capital of Culture, and which ended up being successful. So everyone arrived. It was about 12 to 14 of us in Matera to work on projects, and we had developed and submitted projects in relation to needs addressed by the local community. So there was Coder Dojo Matera and OpenTechSchool Matera, which I was involved in. So setting up free nodes of these initiatives to teach children and people of all ages programming. And we would often hold workshops once, twice, 3 times a week out of the ground floor of the unMonastery building. And then there was unTransit, which is an open data app to map the city's transport system in real time. It won the Open Matera Prize, developed by Elf Pavlik and others. There was Wind, which is an open source hardware, a kind of kite, to harness the wind's energy at high altitudes. And there was Mapping the Commons, was another project. And this is just a selection of some of them that a few of us worked on collaboratively. People were making kind of alternative tourist routes to map the old and new parts of the city. There was interviews with people in the community. There was walking ethnographies. And I worked with them to put them on a web platform, a map, and a few other forms to be able to make these cultural assets and narratives visible to people within the community. So we did a lot of work, but meanwhile, we had a lot of fun. And we were often working on living together and ways of living with the community around, the surrounding community. And this is House Scribe Bembo Davies doing his daily exercises with some friends. And this is not quite an uncommon occurrence. If you see, this is the terrace that overlooked the Garina below. And while we were trying to do a kind of daily liturgy or monastic routine, often we'd get up at 7:45 in the morning and come to this terrace and kind of yell and scream and just dance around. And it wasn't to all of our likings, but we had a good time. And then we'd retire into the building and sit in a circle, usually with a stone in the middle as a talking piece, and just kind of passively update everyone on how we were feeling that day. The question was, how are you feeling today? You could take the piece and say it. And this turned actually, as sometimes kind of cheesy as open space technology or other forms sound, it actually worked quite well when we were doing it. To be able to live with relative strangers for a long period of time in close quarters, and to work with them at the same time. So usually in these kind of work environments that we're in, we don't have this chance to kind of passively update how we're doing, whether it's like, yelling with joy or, something at home might be bothering you. So it was a really different experience for me. And then after the end of the prototype, we all kind of packed our bags with a chance to return in October. But dispersing to different kind of corners of Europe, I went back home briefly and then felt compelled to come back. The energy of the project didn't really disperse. We were constantly communicating over online platforms, EdgeWriter's platform, Google group, having community calls, weekly basis, Google Hangouts. So then we finally kind of all got a chance to reconvene earlier this year at the Global unMonastery Summit, which was kindly hosted by Transmedial. But we set up an apartment for 2 weeks prior to the festival, doing a kind of unMonastery light, where we set up our regular templates for cooking and cleaning together, our zero waste system to be resourceful in what we were spending, and invited people for open dinners, lectures. It was really nice, and we had 3 days of workshops, open workshops at Transmedial, for everything from blockchain technologies like Ethereum to stacktivism to showing some of our own documentation of the project. And then we kind of all gathered in Athens after this point. And all this time people were coming, new people were coming, and people were going and coming back. And we arrived in Athens and had, over the period of kind of December up until this point, and connected with a lot of the grassroots initiatives there. So whether it's collective kitchens or other forms, and solidarity movements, housing for migrants, it seems like a place that we could be useful. And then there's a test lab still active there today. So during the workshop tomorrow, I'll also speak more about this in detail. But just to continue kind of with an overview, this is a graphic Luisa Lapatiana made of our movements coming and going over the past few months, abstracted from an app. And all the while we were doing this kind of moving around, and I say we, and it's a really fluid, amorphous group of people. So we were documenting the process, whether it was templates for budgeting, design patterns for living, which I'll speak about in a little bit, or whether it was, if you see on the left here, the process map. So this kind of was a phasal development theme of an unMonastery. So saying you show up, what do you need to do to get the house in order? What do you need to do to keep the group rhythms moving? And it developed into something of a role-playing board game by the time we were done with it. And the snippet of text below is code uncode, so a series of interviews with monastics, abbots, others, about how monastic rules, so that is rules for living together on a daily basis, a daily liturgy, influence conflict within monasteries, and within other spaces that they reside. And the method kit developed by Ulla Muller. So often while we were doing this and kind of using the method kit to bring out hidden assumptions of what it means to set up a living space together, because you don't normally think about all the things to take into account, we were also thinking, what are we doing? How can we share this in a more effective manner? And often these sessions accompanied a lot of post-its and were quite self-critical. But we kept moving forward and said, well, maybe one of our specialisms could be an idea about the futures of living together or how to live together, because that's something we've kind of set up on the fly quite frequently, and we have all this documentation around it. And often schemas for the future kind of take things like this environment bubble, which is a pod that you never leave, or the Dymaxion residence, where your functions of your residence are quite easily mapped out. Or you have visions that are like the biosphere. You have modular living, you have our ecology from Marco Santi. And then sometimes, at the end of the day, you just kind of end up with this model behind it all, which is a home for a nuclear family. And that doesn't seem to be based on the precariat, based on everyone's resources, based on collective living that we find ourselves in. We're often living with partners, friends, strangers, but still living in these kind of like nuclear paradigms. So how can we rethink that if we don't necessarily think of it from a design perspective, but in a way of being with each other? And from here, I always kind of love looking to Christopher Alexander, who was an architect and urban planner, and he developed this thing called a pattern language. So it's a kind of if this, then that statement that allows urban design to scale rather than to superimpose grand designs on places. But this is a little snippet from that book, Common Areas at the Heart. And I love the little bolded text, which is somewhat rare within the book. And it says, no social group, whether a family, a work group, or a school group, can survive without constant informal contact among its members. So this might be something we know, and you could say online platforms allow this kind of constant informal contact. But what does it look like for a distributed network of people, or for kind of new forms and new ways of living together? And what does this look like when you talk about open source community as well? So open source was kind of a movement often tied to software production, where people would work sometimes alone, sometimes networked with peers to push code together and distribute it for free online with an open source license. But as this kind of concept of open source extends to an organizational ethos and to a kind of culture, we still don't have all of these forms of how to navigate it. When we think about open source entering the domestic space, we think of maybe Internet of Things objects, and we'd prefer to probably have those open source, open license, because we don't want to give our data away and we don't want to have that hardware shut off and no way to fix it. But then if you think about it a little bit beyond what we have in the home and how we relate in the home, and also how the home can support this kind of non-alienated effort for open source development, it becomes interesting and it becomes something slightly novel. And just a little bit of an aside, I was reading this book the other day, Myth and Thought Among the Greeks, and there was this story about how when hosts would welcome strangers into their home, the first thing they would do was take the strangers to the hearth and have them touch the hearth, and then they were welcome anywhere throughout the home. So you don't really want someone to kind of touch your internet-connected lamp. That would be a bit weird. But thinking about these kind of different forms and spaces and ways you can enter them and open them to other people and open them to projects as well. And some more nice fluid diagrams from Alexander on the right there. So we're thinking, how can we share some of our boring documentation, some of our really dense documentation, some of our more esoteric documentation in a legible format? We thought, what about this idea of test labs, kind of small, iterative, experimental spaces from 4 to 6 people to live together and work with the community and have certain intentions around projects, or just to adapt a living space, a squat, whatever it may be, because there's so many hidden assumptions we have when we set it out to live with each other. So we recently compiled all of our manuals and template spreadsheets into a document called the Test Lab Manual. And it covers documentation, life cycles of projects, a protocol, something like monastic rule for how you relate to one another, if this, then that statements, some people might say, and then legal budget and administration work. And we hope to kind of see these projects a bit more and use them as places where people can develop work, much like this, maybe from open source ecology together, or alternative open source finance projects together, or do things like OpenTechSchool. You could even hold it in your own space. You could do open hardware, housing, emergency shelter. Or you could even use your home as an experimental site to be able to open up. So this is the Refugees Welcome platform based in Berlin, or based in Germany, that allows users to kind of share their apartment in almost an Airbnb style, but sometimes crowdsource other forms of funding as well to allow refugees and migrants to stay. So thinking about the home is like a really important site of where we develop things from the ground up. And with the kind of advent of virtual spaces as well, there will be virtual co-working spaces, and you can consider something like Slack already a virtual co-working space. But as more and more of these things come up and become realities, we have to really think about what the embedded forms of them, the skeuomorphs that will be carried over, will be, and to really kind of critique and live within them now, and have some kind of visceral added value to these new spaces. So for the next 200 years, we'll kind of that's about all we have mapped out right now. But it's difficult because it's an age with an influx of people who face impossible living conditions, with destabilizing climate change in the front, with just volatile economies, the precariat, and this project is in large part kind of managed and run on the spare fuel of the precariat. So what are the next 200 years? And all we know kind of right now is it might be a test lab in Athens, where 3 people are working right now with the kind of to set up collective kitchens and shelters. A test lab potentially in Berlin to work along similar lines. A longer term site in 2017 that will probably, well, I say probably, hopefully last our full plan length. So in thinking of that, kind of unMonastery becomes this chimeric social innovation model. And in a lot of different ways, it looks like different things. Sometimes a publishing house, sometimes a group of people yelling and doing kind of odd practices together, and this kind of visceral open home. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of conceptualize what unMonastery could be. And I guess a few things missing up here is like potentially like a distributed pension plan based on social cohesion is one that we might be facing. So I'd say in its 200-year history, it's still in its very early phases as a project. But I would like to close with a brief reading of a text from The Wanderings by Bembo Davies to just give a note on how we would like the project to be used, I suppose, and what it might be good for. So it is a premise of the unMon ethos that the future shall not be as harmonic as could be desired. Islands of beauty can occur, but chances are high that they will be quickly besieged. The various unMonastery projects build upon the hope that we can get there first, that we can devise and offer up an open source impulse to create such islands, that the meeting place of our version of monastic life provides a valuable, flexible model to be adapted by many in the many parts of the world that experience imbalance. The value of the unMonastery name is its reference to the traditions that predate us. As with our historic brethren, forks are inevitable. People and groups will wish to implement the catchy unMon name for diverse purposes. As such, the unMonastery may not be primary code. Human beings have cooperated since before they were human beings. We can only imagine that unMonasteries will evolve into many different forms as different constellations of people respond to different social imperatives. In fact, it is not strictly necessary that all run the same operating system. It may be useful to examine the unMon in the future as an app that provides added flexibility on top of a variety of initiatives. As open source, the unMonastery brand name is our gift to humanity. There are costs and benefits to such openness. However, undeservedly, we shall gain respectability. We can avoid protectionist squabbles. If flying the unMonastery logo wins a band of squatters an extra 7 months of dithering before the police batons descend, then this, in historic terms, demonstrates our added value.